My name's Bob Stone, Professor Bob Stone. I have a chair in extended reality at the University of Birmingham, UK. Well, I was born and bred in Plymouth, which is quite interesting because, as you know, September of 2020 is the 400th anniversary of the Pilgrims sailing from Plymouth, UK to Plymouth in Massachusetts, and that's a project we're working on. I went to university in London, where I did my graduate and postgraduate degrees. I'm very influenced by science fiction, particularly science fiction series, movies, which of course would with your background, and science fiction TV series. So everything I've done has almost been driven by an insatiable need to be involved in science fiction. Very briefly, my career started really when I took my undergraduate degree in psychology and decided that clinical psychology was not really for me. I just can't sit still. I did a master's degree in ergonomics, or human factors, as you guys in the States call it. And that was the turning point in my career. And I was offered a job at what was then British Aerospace, which was one of the leading aerospace companies in the UK. And as a result of that, I got involved in doing space telerobotics work for the European Space Agency. Attending a conference in Maryland at NASA Goddard, I think it was invited over to NASA Ames in California by a wonderful guy called Dr. Steve Ellis. And he introduced me to his colleague Scott Fisher, who then put this headset thing on me and this glove thing on me. I've still got the video. I found myself on a wireframe, a really, really primitive wireframe graphic of an ascending escalator. And my eyes were telling me I was going up, and my inner ear was telling me, no, you're not. And I came out of that thinking, wow, this is just phenomenal. And I said, that was 34 years ago. It was a game changer as far as I was concerned. The great thing about the guys there, Steve Ellis and Scott Fisher, two lovely guys, is that they were not so much fazed by the technology, but they were looking at the human factors aspects. I suppose I haven't been the same since.
That's fantastic. I was at NASA at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, working there for the year 1987. And
wow.
It was an engineering firm that I was a contractor at NASA. I wasn't employed by NASA. One of the projects they were working on was a simulator of the Manned Maneuvering Unit, the MMU, the jetpack that the astronaut wore.
Yes.
We had a chair in the lab where you had the actual MMU controls on this, just a regular office swivel chair. And so right around the same time you were putting on the goggles for the first time, I was experiencing flying around from the space shuttle and maneuvering myself back just by pressing these buttons on my little office chair.
That's absolutely fascinating. I mean, I had a very good contact at Johnson, a guy called Aaron Cohen, who was leading the orbiter, the shuttle program at the time. I did actually get to visit Johnson. There was this very highly polished surface that you could thrust yourself around. You would try and reach out with an astronaut glove on to try and do some work. And as you touch something, it was propelled you in the opposite direction to create this zero-G effect. NASA Johnson, and walking up alongside that the Saturn V rocket.
Right. That was going to be Apollo 18.
That was going to be 18, right?
That's going to be the next Apollo mission. So they have it horizontal and separated into pieces, and you can walk around it.
All NASA had were a couple of pocket TVs from Radio Shack inside what looked like a motorcycle helmet, and this glove with very flimsy fiber optics on. But the experience was just absolutely amazing. The graphics were incredibly primitive by today's standard, but that illusion of being there and being on that moving structure was just unbelievably compelling.
One of the things that I want to focus on in my document, and thank you for being a part of it, is the CGI, because that's been my passion for years. You've done so many different simulations over the 1980s, the 1990s, 2000s, up until, today in 2020. So how have you seen the CGI evolve?
1 year after my experience at NASA Ames in California, this guy, David Smith, who also ran a company called Mindscape over in the States, brought out this game called The Colony. This, from my point of view, was a revolution, because it's 1 year after seeing the wireframe graphics. This was flat shaded, real, genuine 3D, that you could navigate this game in pretty close to real time, and you could go out and explore the colony. And every time you turn a corner, there were these very friendly-looking aliens. We weren't very friendly, but the most incredible thing about this was it was originally launched for the Apple Mac. This I managed to get off eBay. This is the IBM DOS version, and again, the quality of the graphics that we had back then But it was real time. It was the first time a game had come out that would allow the player to move around and render the image in real time. Subsequent to the colony, David Smith brought out a toolkit called the Virtus Walkthrough. And that was the first ever desktop 3D design tool for building virtual worlds. That was my first introduction to what real-time CGI could actually look like. 10 years later, we had 1998. The other big step from my perspective was Unreal, the game Unreal. I mean, that was just a complete game changer. The quality of the graphics, the fact that they had developed this C++ algorithm for rendering the graphics and doing things like very clever level of detail modeling, very, very clever zone culling, so they could focus on the materials, the textures, the shading effects in real time. And the fact that Unreal came with its own editing toolkit, allowing people to build their own aliens and their own levels, it was a game changer. But it was a massive gap of 10 years. We had one of the first ever Silicon Graphics reality engines in the UK. And we were talking about £250,000 UK, and for something that we now take for granted on a £1,000 graphics-enabled laptop. I just wish I could get it going on IBM DOSBox on the computer. And of course, then post 1998, the serious games community exploiting the Unreal Engine, the Half-Life engine, the Crytek engine for the game CryEngine. That was a massive evolution where the games companies were demanding more and more and more of the graphics accelerator companies, and the quality then just rose exponentially to produce the toolkits that we're working on today.
For the Mayflower 2020 project, what is your graphics rendering engine?
Yeah, the engine and toolkit we use is Unity. We have experimented with others, but Unity is simply because, and I must admit, I'm not a graphics specialist. I'm just a frail human factors specialist. But my team are very much biased towards using Unity. And the reason we use Unity is not just because of the quality. A lot of people still use the Unreal 4 engine, and maybe the Unreal 5 engine if it gets brought out. There are a lot of people who use that, particularly for large-scale procedural train models, and there's nothing to touch it. Unity is great because we can use Unity for VR projects, AR projects, and MR, mixed reality projects, as we're doing for the British military. And it comes with a fantastic asset capability, online assets. One of my students last year created this fantastic vista mountain scene using assets that we bought from the Unity Asset Store for no more than $40. And that's now being used in hospitals to help people calm themselves. And it's narrated by Sir David Attenborough. But she actually bought a $40 Northern Lights special effect. And it's fabulous.
And that was probably built by someone sitting in his basement, or her basement, figuring it out. And then they posted it to Unity as an asset. And now the world is free to use it for $40.
That's right. It's non-stop. If you want water effects, if you want mist effects, if you want clever physics effects. And this is great for my students who are, first and foremost, they're electronics students. So they come to me with no 3D experience at all. But the fact that they can download Unity for free and then bring these assets in and focus on using the assets to tell the story, knowing full well that building 3D worlds will not get them their degree, but they can put together all these fantastic things, makes all the difference.
The better it looks, the more engaging the experience.
Certainly for things like visualizing scenes of nature, like, for example, you mentioned Mayflower. I mean, we will be using Unity for Mayflower. So we will rely on a high degree of realism to have a 1620s model of the harbour from which the Mayflower set sail 400 years ago. But one of the things that human factors has taught me, and one of the things that the guys at NASA taught me, is you don't have to have fantastic photorealistic effects to succeed in delivering the training that the end users require.
Have you done research on that? I don't think it's the same as the uncanny valley in CGI. Is there a place where it has to be a certain level of realism, but it doesn't matter if it goes beyond that?
It's a good question. This has been quite a hard experience working with games companies. What we found was that the more rendering power or the more rendering effects you give to people, the more they will introduce things into their virtual worlds. Not because it's needed, but because they can. Actually, we found that with Silicon Graphics, when reality engines hit the world, people were building all kinds of ethereal type worlds, which looked absolutely fabulous, but typically tended to distract the end user from the training content. And that's where my background as human factors specialist comes in, is being able to observe what the people are doing, observe what the end requirements are and the end users, what they're capable of, what they're not capable of, and then try and specify the fidelity as close as we can to their needs. That's my particular research area. I think it's a case of, that's my I think that's the fire alarm has just gone off in the hall of our house.
You need to go take care of a fire in your apartment.
No, I don't think it's a fire. People say XR means extended reality. I just use it as X marks the spot. For X, put in V, put in A, put in M. VR is all about real-time interaction with computer-generated databases, which typically tend to be graphical, but of course involve sound, can involve very basic haptics, and can be delivered using head-mounted displays and gloves, but not exclusively. You can also, for example, interact with virtual worlds using a keyboard, mouse, and screen, Xbox controller, whatever. So it's not, you do not have to wear a headset to be immersed in a virtual world. Augmented reality, as we've seen, popularly with games like Pokemon Go, but also with a lot of the videos, some of which are questionable, from the likes of the HoloLens, Magic Leap, and what have you. Augmented reality is all about taking and superimposing those objects and associated media, text, 2D graphics, video, onto the real world. Mixed reality is a variant of that, in that what we're trying to do is use aspects of the real world to make the virtual more believable. So it's kind of flipping AR on its side. So in the case, for example, of our the medical casualty evacuation project that we're doing with the UK Ministry of Defence, what we have is a virtual reality headset modified with a single camera, single high definition camera, and we use chroma key so that anything that's blue or green inside a fixed enclosure will be represented to the wearer as the inside of, let's say, a Chinook helicopter. So when they look around, they can see avatars, they can see the side of the internal fuselage, they can look at the weapons guys fore and aft, they can hear the sounds of a Chinook in flight. When they look at anything that's not blue, such as their body, their arms, their hands, a very realistic looking casualty mannequin, synthetic mannequin, on a stretcher, mission critical items of medical equipment, which are not blue, they will see those things as real, almost as if they're inside the virtual helicopter. And more importantly, they can reach out with their hands and they can touch the real objects with their real hands. So going back to the 1990s, when I invented this, the Teletact, which is the Teletact glove, which is basically is a series of little air pockets and these microcapillary tubes that feed the air pockets, invented back in 1990. We're not relying on cumbersome wearable equipment like this. What we're relying on is your real hand touching real physical material. In doing that, it makes mixed reality, makes the whole virtual world a lot more believable. Because we're selecting key elements, we are ensuring that those elements that are crucial to training are not represented virtually. They will respond as you expect them to respond, not as the virtual world approximates their response. And then telepresence, which is why I got involved with the great guys back at NASA Ames back in 1987. Telepresence is using very similar technology to virtual reality, but in conjunction with robotics, remote systems, creating the illusion for the human operator of these systems that he or she is present at a remote hazardous work site, be it underwater, nuclear, or obviously, or indeed if NASA were interested in space.
And tell me about the submarine project that you worked on.
We worked on a number of projects. We actually developed the UK's first submarine training virtual reality project, which we carried out an 18-month-long experiment. We showed that the kids who trained using virtual reality performed better in becoming spatially aware on board a real nuclear submarine. And as a result of that work, we were contacted by a charity called SHIPS. SHIPS stands for Shipwrecks in Plymouth Sound. And the divers were very keen to dive on the wreck of HMS A7, which is one of the first ever British-designed submarines, after the Holland submarine, which was developed in the US by electric boat. Now, initially they wanted some three-dimensional representation so they could practice what they were going to do when they went down there. It was 100 and, I can't remember, it was 170, 180 feet, but they would only have limited time down there. So we built a simple model. They all identified between them which parts they were going to concentrate on, given the lack of time they had. And then they brought up all of the videos, and including videos of some very, very huge conger eels, and we were able to then take that information and use it to increase the detail of the wreck site. That was a very rewarding project, part of what we call virtual heritage, which is the love of my life, if you like, in VR. Being able to make the invisible visible and to take people back in time to days gone past.
To build that submarine, I think you said you made it with 3ds Max?
We made the original model with 3ds Max. The textures were done using some of the rendering toolkits that are available, or the sub toolkits that are available with Unity. So things like being able to put crustacea and other flora and fauna on board the ship itself. We were able then to use that as a template for selecting different new textures, new rendering effects. We used fogging effects to create texture, and we used very, very simple particle effects to simulate the movement of fish around the conning tower and so on. So it was a combination of effects to come up with the final model.
You did a project using drones and you mapped terrains. What was the technology involved in that?
That was commercial technology, in all fairness. It goes hand in hand with the interest of the team and I in heritage sites. So some of the heritage sites in the southwest of the country, on places like Dartmoor, some of the very old granite quarries, and the granite quarries that used to build the original London Bridge, granite that was used to build Nelson's Column in Trafalgar Square, were honed out of the granite in Dartmoor. Some of these quarries are huge. To build them from scratch by hand would have taken months and months and cost an enormous amount. So we've been using DJI drones, in particular DJI Inspire, more recently the Mavic, to fly in a scanning pattern over the areas and to be able to use something called Pix4D, a commercial package that enables your video and the actual coordinates that are logged, the altitude, the angle of the camera, the GPS data from the drone, to match these two together and to produce a point cloud that gives you the topography of the scene, but also, because the video link gives you the textures, the pixels, that enable you to make it in photorealistic detail. And we then export that from the Pix4D package into Unity and patch it onto a slightly lower resolution general model of the terrain. And that saves us an enormous amount of time. And we've been doing that too in places like Drake's Island, the famous Drake's Island in Plymouth Sound, where we've also been using Matterport 3D scanners, time of flight, sort of laser type scanners to build the underground, the Napoleonic tunnels on the island as well, which has been really, really exciting. Very few people are allowed to go on that island, and we can now capture that, distribute it to schools and the general public.
Can you tell us a little bit about the space shuttle I see behind you?
Print on the wall behind me is a print called Challenger's Glory, which is based on a picture that was produced by an artist after the tragic explosion of the shuttle all those years ago. You, being involved with NASA Johnson, will remember all too well, sadly. And the prints were produced so that the proceeds from the sale of the print could go to the Challengers' families. So I couldn't resist it. I was very lucky, being a Brit, to get hold of one of these. It takes pride of place on the wall.
Share with us the model launch vehicle that you've got over there.
This is a model that one of my colleagues helped me with by 3D printing the main structure of, and then by buying things like 1/32 scale rubber tires and ladders and an Apollo astronaut. I put the detail onto the ship. This is the Vulture. The Vulture was from a short-lived science fiction series starring Andy Griffiths called Salvage One. And Salvage One was all about sending the Vulture rocket into space to collect debris from the moon and to turn it into a commercial business. So it's not one of the science fiction models that you can buy. Anyone who remembers that series will know that this is giving away my age. I'm surrounded by a whole load of models in progress. Jerry Anderson TV series, which you may recall, called Fireball XL5.
I do remember that. That was all done with puppets.
Exactly, it was done with puppets, and I'm just finishing off the cockpit detail now. And again, it's drives my wife mad, but it keeps me going.
I was at SIGGRAPH this past year, and in the virtual reality theater, I got to put on the goggles, and it was as if I was in the space station with all the astronauts moving around. Have you had a chance to experience that one?
I've not experienced that one. I remember it was an Unreal version of the International Space Station that I showed for many years, where you could literally fly around and look at the different cupolas and you look down on the Earth. It was really quite exhilarating. We have got a virtual reality space station model, nowhere near as sophisticated as the one that you saw, but again, just to inspire school kids that get involved in virtual reality and look where it could take you.
I was asking you if I'd left out any projects that you wanted to talk about or that you felt were significant, and also talk about what you see for the future of VR.
In terms of any projects that we've left out, I mean, not really. There's loads of projects on our website, and I say the projects that I love most, the ones that get Team and I out on the road. So I've never ever subscribed to building an expensive flash virtual reality center. I believe in taking technology to people rather than people trying to make pilgrimages to something that becomes a technological mausoleum. Things like virtual heritage. We've been doing things from the submarine project you mentioned, Drake's Island, the world's first submarine fatality back in the 1700s, right through to recently where we did an autonomous vessel survey of a reservoir in Devon and discovered the remains of some World War II torpedo nets. And that was a project which I love because we were able to send one of our little remotely operated submersibles down to film the fact they were still down there. And presenting that to the local village, not a huge international conference, but the local village, presenting that to a small school somewhere in the countryside. That's what I enjoy most of all. In terms of the future, very good question. The form factor of virtual reality headsets is improving almost monthly, I would say. The Oculus Quest, with its inside-out tracking, its standalone capability, albeit quite limited, and its ability to track the hands most recently, excellent step in the right direction. The wearability is obviously improving. We're seeing many patents being produced, looking at sunglasses or spectacle-sized headsets. I hope that happens because in many respects, the displays and the optics haven't changed that much since the 1980s. They're better resolution, slightly better field of view, slightly, but they haven't changed that much. And we do need step change for this technology to become ubiquitous. Interactive devices, yes, definitely we need someone to crack the haptics issue. There's some very expensive, very flimsy looking, very unwearable items on the web at the moment. They don't really deliver the kind of tactile resolution that the human hand needs to engage in surgery, for example. Things like sound, 3D spatial sound has always been well developed. Ever since the 1980s, I remember the company who produced a number of soundboards for PCs, and since then, sound has been very much ahead of the game in terms of delivering sense to humans. Smell, I think we need smell. I wouldn't say it urgently, but it would be good to have smell because a really believable, credible sense of smell will invoke emotions, it will invoke memories.
Of olfactory banquet. So I began first on the easiest, roast beef, old books, mown grass, and Mexican farmyard. Now, you hold out of this. Okay. Now, hold it up there. Okay. Now, what do you smell?
Smell.
It's one of those stimuli that is so important to some of the defense projects that we do. Some of our defense medics only remember the smell of aviation fuel when they go on board a Chinook rescue helicopter. But it's also important for things like healthcare. So a lot of our virtual scenes of nature, to be able to include a subtle smell of the countryside, of pine, of the smell of the ocean. As soon as you move from a graphics-only demonstration to a graphics plus sound, the immersion is improved 100 times. If you could add smell, I believe we'd see another step change. So those are the things I'd like to see in the next 10 years, please. They're on my wish list. Decent haptics, small displays, augmented reality displays that actually work in the outside world, and smell.
You were talking about the need to be able to see your virtual display in bright sunlight.
It's a complete limitation. You know the issue of taking your tablet or your smartphone. Once you take those outside, it's really difficult to see anything that you recognize, and everything's just completely washed out. And augmented reality has got such a big part to play in the virtual heritage projects that we want to do. As mentioned, being able to see the Mayflower set sail from the real Plymouth Hoe and sail across the Plymouth Hoe out in the distance. Or things like being able to see old railway locomotives going across a very desolate part of the moors in the southwest. We can't do that until these things improve dramatically. And at the moment, the commercial headset, the commercial augmented reality headsets, they're simply not there. And again, that would be one of the things on my wish list.
I said there was something else I wanted to talk about. What's going on over there? What's it like with the COVID epidemic?
The death toll rises daily. It's just been announced today that there's another 750 odd people have died in 24 hours. We're well over 6,000 deaths now, I think. It is quite weird being in lockdown. I mean, my wife and I can take the dog for a walk. You're only allowed to have one exposure per day of no longer than an hour. Of course, our Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, is in intensive care. He's not on a ventilator. He's on oxygen. But obviously his symptoms worsened over the weekend and they've taken him into one of the London hospitals. So we're surviving. The food's not too bad. I mean, we're obviously watching what's going on in New York State. That's frightening. What you guys are facing is absolutely frightening.
It's hard not to be upset when you see that there was a lot that could have been done and that just wasn't, and it continues to be that way. And the healthcare workers here are continuing to go into battle every day without their protective gear.
The main news bulletins, 6 o'clock and 9 o'clock, cover what Trump says and what's going on, and the mayor of New York, all the good folks over there. And similar stories, we've got healthcare workers who are sadly dying, nurses, midwives, surgeons. There was one guy really, really sad. He'd already asked that if he passed away because of COVID, could he be buried with his surgical scrubs on? Absolutely heartbreaking. And no matter what the government says, it's still the case that people are screaming for decent quality protective equipment.
So it's the same there as it is here, apparently.
Yeah, obviously on a smaller scale because we're only quite a tiny island, but relatively speaking, it's as bad.
Well, stay healthy, my friend.
Are you in lockdown?
Oh, yeah. I'm here with my girlfriend. We go out for walks each day, but we have to wear masks now.
Yeah.
I'm concerned personally as the Pioneers chair of SIGGRAPH. What are we going to do about the SIGGRAPH conference? I was supposed to speak at the World Science Fiction Convention where they hand out the Hugo Awards every year. By the way, I was right across the lake from you. My girlfriend and I went to Ireland and Northern Ireland last August for the World Science Fiction Convention. And this year we were really looking forward to going to New Zealand, and I scheduled some in-person interviews. I would rather do these interviews in person with a film crew.
Absolutely.
And I had that scheduled for New Zealand, but they decided very early on to virtualize the conference. So I'll be in New Zealand from the same chair I'm sitting in now. All right. Well, you and your wife and all the people that you care about, your researchers, stay well.
Yeah, Ed, bless you. Thank you ever so much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
It has been for me as well, and I look forward to seeing you in person sometime.
One day, seeing in person would be fantastic.
It would. All right. Thank you, Bob.